Thank you, Julie, for giving us one more opportunity to collaborate and participate in mischief making in the world. I guess all of that earned me the distinction of being the first speaker. In this crowd, I could say, now I know what the openers in a cricket match feel like. Because everything is riding on this, so I need to get close to half a century. The intimacies of touch invested human bodies with lethal potential. The orthodoxies of proximity upended, left few bodies safe. Queer times. In these queer times, in search of the perfect place, we discovered the no place of the virtual world. Where Michel Foucault talks about mirrors as a place to understand what a heterotopia would be, we had instead webcams. Webcams that projected our bodies onto screens and into places, meaning taking us there where we are not. Heterotopias abound. Our present global challenges threaten to overwhelm a small biblical book like Jonah. Because for us to engage the spatialities and temporalities of this book, whether we're talking about the depth down to the bottom of the ocean or its height, looking back up from the bottom of the ocean to the sea, its breadth, the size of the city of Nineveh, its past, its futures, what doing so does, it makes us aware of the enormity of our own reality that we face today. The strange book, though, may no longer seem so strange given these square times in which we live. A fish's stomach as a worship space, an imperial city that dresses in drag, a desert plant for a shade, are exactly the kinds of spaces of alternate ordering that make up heterotopias. Our many experiments in sociality over the past 2 years, away from the norm, pushed us into deviant spaces that make heterotopias all too real. And perhaps Jonah might become ordinary to some extent during these times. In any event, I think we are primed to understand a book like this, because the extensive studies of the reception of Jonah show us how easily an exceptional book like this can be appropriated and made normative, where its edges are dulled, while its teeth are being sharpened to bite into certain groups in order to keep them in line. So, the scholar Jasmine Puar reminds us, queer times require even queerer modalities of thought. And with that wish, I hope that those are the kinds of things we'll be doing in the next few days. So in this paper, I make the claim that queerness serves as a useful tool in the politics of freedom, precisely because social ordering benefits from difference. But despite the appreciation of difference, the contributions of queerness affords it very little gains. In building this claim, I will look at heterotopic spaces in the book and Jonah's relationship with these spaces and objects. My central focus is the space outside of the city of Nineveh in chapter 4. And I begin with identifying how I understand this term heterotopia and which spaces within the book will fit into that category. In the next section, I describe Jonah as square and his relationships with those heterotopic spaces. And then finally, I analyze the space in the desert where Jonah's relationship with the plant interrogates the material dimensions of divine power as a source of freedom. And hopefully through all of this, that makes sense to you and you understand it and it sets the stage for everybody else. Okay? Essentially, that's my hope. So first, Jonah's heterotopias. Now, like prophetic literature, Jonah contains utopian ideals. The book asks its readers, imagine a world where the power of empire exists in a different way. Either that empire is to destroy the city of the imperial capital of Assyria, or it is reformed so that it does what some people will regard as doing good in the world. That's a utopian vision. But the book ends seemingly in a debate about these two options and suggests that the aspiration is really for a world where divine power takes over from empires. And the divine power is seen in the same imperial contours, this time only doing good. Again, questionable. But the disputed histories regarding the existence or non-existence of Nineveh at the time of the writing of the book is what I think confirms the impulses, the utopian impulses of the book. There are many different ways where people will critique utopia, because it's a no place, it's a fantasy. Bill Ashcroft, a post-colonial scholar, will tell us that all of these features should make Jonah into what's called a post-colonial utopia, because it's preoccupied with empire. But instead, I will argue that the book fits more into the category of the imperial utopia because of the kinds of concerns that it raises, concerns about freedom and coercion, a struggle between education and manipulating desire, and the necessity of an imposition of the law and the rule of the enlightened. These seem to be much more formative for the book in some sense, if you follow the normal patterns of the book. These concerns come into focus in the final chapter, Under the Desert Plant. As such, there is much in the book regarding preferred futures, even as it struggles with its imperfect present. And my preference then is not so much to abandon this notion of utopia, but to take it in a different direction, a different register, under the term heterotopia. A term sort of given to us and given currency by Michel Foucault. And they may appear to be different sides of the same coin. Instead, I want to think of them as sitting along a continuum, a spectrum of change. Kenneth Surin offers that utopias point to a better future in order to escape an awful present. But instead, Heterotopias offers glimpses of possibilities in the present. So rather than kind of looking into the future, it's like, let's see what's here now and what possibilities exist for change and freedom and transformation now. As sites, though, these heterotopic sites are a combination of what's real and what's fantastic. Because the real, meaning true freedom, has not yet happened and may never happen, even if all you have is just this momentary glimpse into some form of freedom. But rather than seeing heterotopias as sort of the next best thing, heterotopias can be understood as a queering practice, a place where a place that privileges the embodied knowledge of queer folk, taking that knowledge seriously, and at the same time refusing to accede to the power of gender orthodoxies. So both affirming and at the same time critiquing, where the issues now are the embodied experiences of queer people. The attractiveness of these spaces as counter-science may not always capture the fact that they are momentary, that they are fleeting, that they are difficult, and at the same time, they expose the interlocking web of oppressions that are needed in order to dismantle those oppressions to gain some freedom. So in other words, I'm trying to say heterotopias are not utopic, even as they gesture to those spaces where these sites of freedom. At best, they are what Hetherington refers to as spaces of deferral. A time when we can see the possibilities real and feel it a little bit, and we experiment with ideas and practices in search of freedom with the hope that they may be achieved, even also acknowledging that they may have little chance for success. So that was me taking you up and then bringing you back down. Kind of keeping it real if you want to go with that term, right? So a glimpse of the future, a glimpse of freedom, an experience of freedom, even recognizing that there's a lot of hard work and hard intersectional work in order to achieve that and finding and carving out what those spaces look and feel like. So several spaces in the book of Jonah resemble heterotopias. The ship with the sailors is an obvious choice, if only for the fact that Michel Foucault names ships as the heterotopias par excellence. Ships in general, and the ship in Jonah, are closed sites that at the same time are open to possibilities to achieve perfection. And what Foucault says is, look, ships get you on a sea, it's fluid. You can go from port to port. You could try things out. And there's infinite possibilities that you could have. And of course, in the book, the ship gives Jonah these possibilities: a pathway to another city, a place where his confession of faith is neither mocked nor taken too seriously. A company of seekers who are ready to engage with the divine, and to engage the divine in such a way that they can manipulate nature with the divine. So a unique space within the book, one that I think has some possibilities. The next place is the guts of the ship, and that holds some possibilities as much as the ship. The fish entrails, which my friend Ziona Havea prefers to translate as the guts of the fish. If everyone wants to live in such a space, it's an adaptable space because it accommodates all kinds of confessions. And you will see this in chapter 2, where Jonah is perhaps kind of closest to his Orthodox best there, and he is able to voice a psalm and do some kinds of gestures that feel normative and religious in some sense, even while being authentic to himself. It's a site that allows the type of forced entry. In other words, you don't just walk into the guts of a fish. You kind of push there. And so those sites like those don't just easily open doors for anyone. It's forced entry, perhaps on the repetition of some kind of formula. And then you can do kind of what you want to do there. Thirdly, the city of Nineveh combines both temporal and spatial features of heterotopia. In its appearance in the book, Nineveh is also what Foucault might call a heterochronic, a place where time accumulates. Nineveh in the book is both dead and living, destroyed maybe in 612 BCE, but maybe not. Certainly in the imagination of the book, a menacing imperial city. So either way, it's kind of we're floating between times at the time spectrum here, or either it's death or it's life. And Nineveh, in its many histories, and as an imagined space in the book, matches the extensive afterlives of the book of Jonah as a book, which my colleague will tell you about, Sophina will tell you about much later on. This dead city exerts this pull in the book to reveal to us, through the actions of its residents, the many ways imperial civilizations try to remake themselves in order to stay alive. Okay? So the fasting, the putting on sackcloth, all of these are the efforts to sustain and keep the city going. These just mirror the kinds of things that cities will do. And they will do this even after they're dead and gone, because they live on in museums and libraries and textbooks. There's a uniqueness about Nineveh which I hope we could explore in another place and time. I don't have the room to do this here. Now, the desert plant is the final heterotopia that I name. I'm aware that I make several interpretive conclusions while reserving judgment in other places when I talk about the desert plant. The space outside of the city of Nineveh may or may not be a desert. However, from the descriptions of Jonah's physical needs in the book, I conclude that he's in a space with little vegetation that can provide shade, not the African savanna. I think it's worse than that. At least you may find some shade there. But additionally, I draw attention to how major cities contribute to the destruction of the environment on their outskirts that can lead to desertification. And so I want to lean forward and talk about the setting as desert. And I restrain myself on the matter of what in the Hebrew is called the kikayom. I just simply call it a plant and translate it as a plant. without making too much commitment to the type of vegetation. And I'll talk about it as the vegetation a little bit later. But that site, under that plant, in that desert, several incompatibilities come together in the space that forms the scene of the final chapter. And that's another feature of Heterotopias, a place that combines all of these unlikely things that should not fit together in order to exist. A hurriedly made booth, decorated with a plant with an odd lifespan, sitting at the edge of an imperial city. This desperate and disparate landscape scene serves as the setting for a compressed expression of life and death, with the potential to go in either direction. The city can be destroyed, but it's not. The wind should topple the booth, but it doesn't. The plant should live beyond a single day, but it doesn't. And the misanthropic Jonah should receive reproof from the divine. Well, we don't know. That's a question. These anticipated verities do not occur. It's precisely the things we believe that should happen in this space do not come to pass, which make it such a grand heterotopic space. They do not happen suggests that the space is not only heterotopic, but also queer. For in this space, Jonah's orientation device, as Sarah Ahmed calls it, the object that places his body into space, is what renders him queer, that object being the desert plant. Jonah expresses one of the most significant affective attachments to anything in the book and in this plant, and gives us a big insight into his emotional state, something I hope I have the time to say a lot more about later on. So, but let me talk about Jonah and his queerness. Now, is Jonah among the prophets? The question gets not only to Jonah's performance in the episodes of the book, but also to Jonah in general. Now, at verse 3 of chapter 1, Jonah demonstrates a penchant to depart from normative prophetic behavior. Right? Word of the Lord came, we're supposed to hear something else, following all of the other prophets. But this verse is set within the cultural norms of prophetic vocation, where the divine commission anticipates some resistance. Jonah crosses the line into blatant refusal. And I will keep using that word quite a bit, following some of Sarah Ahmed's understanding, the line, straight, and traversing it. Because here is where we see the queerness of Jonah emerging. Within what she calls a queer subject within straight culture, hence deviates, and is made socially present as a deviant, guy who's just willing to step over the line. And he's stepping over the line with a divine commission. If Jonah enters the book queerly through the refusal of the Nineveh commission, the book's end should leave us in no doubt about Jonah's queerness. Perhaps at the time he exits the city, Jonah thinks that the events came to pass as he anticipated while he was still on his ground. And again, thanks to Zione Haver for this understanding of that word, not just what he talked about when he was in his country, but in the space that oriented him in his initial understanding of life. That is to say, what we see at Jonah at the end of the book is not something that just emerged for him then. The queerness that we may want to assign to him then pre-existed. His refusal that we see in chapter 1. That is to say, Jonah may very well have been a deviant from the get-go. The comment that he makes then reveals not so much Jonah's prescience, but someone practiced in the art of refusing to participate in normative spaces. Someone who has tried for some time to exist within the discomfort of straight cultures asking him to fit in. And where else might Jonah have questioned the use of divine power and refused to participate with it? Where else might he have questioned the imposition of the divine will to bend people in order to keep them in line? In the commission to Jonah, Nineveh is set up as, a deviant space, something that exists outside of the norms of society. Now, we never know what fully constitutes the evil that Nineveh is supposed to have practiced, as told to us in the first verse. By the end, though, we get a sense that the Ninevites seem undiscerning when it comes to the issue of orientation. Where is the left side? Where is the right side? Which is straight, which is not? Which is in, which is out? They seem to blur these things. To that extent, Jonah's mission may well have been involved in straightening Nineveh. Then this site, this task, is something that then points out to us why it is Jonah is resistant to actually taking on the commission. If that's how the city is being described, as a queer prophet seems like a contradiction in terms. The prophetic task of calling out failures and pressing communities back into a line of normalcy would then seem like an ill fit for Jonah. Not the first prophet to disavow the title. Even the book itself cannot cannot come to the point of naming Jonah as a prophet. And up to preparing this, I thought there was at least once when it called Jonah a prophet, but then I had to look again and realize never once is he named a prophet. Jonah's prophetic performances are of two types. They're either deviant or they're simply forced. Well, I talked about the deviant one. First time he just refused. And the second time, he's forced into performing the role of the prophet. Now, we are privy to all of the locations where the divine word encounters prophets. For Jonah, the guts of the fish is where he gets his best divine experiences. Otherwise, outside of that, Jonah's encounters with the divine are either tiresome quarrels or unproductive ones. Absent the performances of ritual and only the hint of a future sacrifice, Jonah does not strike the pose of an observant prophet. Reluctant prophet insufficiently captures the sight of Jonah cringing his way through Nineveh with a brief word of denunciation, forcefully brought in line to perform the task of calling this city back and keeping it in line. Jonah takes at least a day's journey through the city before he could start issuing the threat. Someone forced to fit in to a role that he doesn't want to inhabit. Jonah perverts divine orthodoxies that reveal his latent queerness. The central confrontation in the book revolves around the divine nature that has been codified into dogma. I knew you were a gracious God, slow to anger, blah, blah, blah. That's the dogma I'm referring to. The inadequacies of this dogmatic declaration seem to have been a long-standing problem for Jonah. Even before he gets to Nineveh, this is his complaint. I knew this is what you were. This is what he's saying in chapter 4. I knew this even before we got started. Now, Amick talks about perversion in the spatial sense, what she talks about as a willful determination to go counter or against orthodoxy. And that's a way for us to understand the queerness of Jonah. In this space, and in regards to this, he is willing to go against that dogmatic orthodoxy. If divine grace functions as a tool of manipulation to bring those who have crossed the line into deviance back into line, and is to straighten them out, then we could understand Jonah's resistance to this task. Because Jonah does not want to perform a mission like this, of saying to people who have crossed the line, come back in. Especially when he himself has very little appreciation for that line. So what's more appropriate then, as we could see as this book unfolds, for the deviant city Nineveh than to have the spared deviant prophets announced through a body disciplined by normative conformity that they too can receive divine grace. Because one of the questions I've always asked is, here's this guy refusing to go. No one else on the team that could take it can do the job? The answer to that is they may very well be. This task, Jonah is needed. And that deviant body disciplined into that conformity is what's necessary. He's performing what Judge Bipura regards as homo-nationalism, this combination of nationalism and homosexuality, where queerness is normalized in the service of these bigger nationalist goals as a means of forcing other places, other countries into submission, while at the same time oppressing racial, ethnic, and sexual diversity. In this case, the deviant prophet performs a useful function to threaten the imperial city with lethal divine power. And in response, Nineveh accepts and capitulates to the superiority of the divine power and saves itself through rituals that at best seem like drag performances. And I hope to, at some point, to push this a little bit further. I don't have the time to do it. The drag here gestures to how queer people perform straight orthodoxies, where queerness has to pretend to be straight. In other words, the divine threat forces Nineveh's queerness, whether in their military exercises or their tolerance of sexual diversity, it forces their queerness undercover. And the peevish response of Jonah, I told you so, questions the role that his queerness plays within the divine economy and how grace is dispensed in pursuit of queer liberation. Finally, let's look at the plans. The desert location serves as the most generative of the heterotopic spaces in the book of Jonah. Since this is also the space of real disputation in the book, a face-to-face encounter occurs here unlike any that we've seen before. Jonah selects the location outside of the city, constructs it, and it is later divinely decorated. The invocations of a wilderness setting point to this as a normative place for prophetic discernment. But however, Jonah, in this space, is contesting that prophetic task. He's not like Elijah, whose existential crisis in the wilderness is that I didn't perform effectively as a prophet. His crisis is, I don't want this job. I don't want to be doing stuff like this. And that is exemplified in Jonah's, where Jonah doubles down on marginalization in the erection of a booth. That truly, in some ways, says this is all provisional and this is a shaky and complex experience. An ideal heterotopic site where that embraces several forms of exclusion. This desert location gives Jonah a chance to stage another layer of his protest. The arrival of the plant enhances the space for Jonah because he now has an object that orients him to the world. His body can occupy space and shape it in a way in response to what I'm able to call a queer object. The plant becomes the queer object that gives him that chance. But in the rarity of the plant lies its queerness. Since queer objects are not easily accessible to provide that sense of orientation. For the first time, we see Jonah experience authentic joy in relation to another living being when he rejoices over the plant. At best, Jonah finds himself at home under the plant. As much joy as Jonah finds in the plant, the space highlights several realities of queer life. Real community with like-minded humans remain absent for Jonah. While he encounters real humans in the course of his travels, he never finds his people. The vegetal intimacy that he experiences here only serves to remind us of his queerness and how isolating queerness can be in a world that's overdetermined by straightness. The fleeting moments of joy brought to him compliments of the divine intervention only highlight how complicating theological orthodoxies can be in pursuit of such freedom. Should the plant be the source of Jonah's object lesson, the learning outcome only enforces what Jonah already knows. Queerness has only a limited utility in the divine economy. The source of his queer joy, the object that truly shapes his orientation in the world, lasts only so long because divine action prevents it taking up a permanent place in his life. But even more, that queer object surfaces in the conversation in a way that reinforces the divine project in Nineveh. A divine project that basically is invested in ensuring that those who stray over the line come back into line. Only so much deviance is allowed before cities and prophets are brought back into line. Queerness at best is only fleeting, only a utility as long as it serves to keep and reaffirm straight spaces. The loss of the plant pleads Jonah's case for the divine attention to queerness. If the material dimensions of power mean that divine attention will only focus largely upon things on a grander scale, the question is raised, what does that mean for queer life that only exists on smaller scales? Here is Jonah repeating a death wish. I claim he wants to die like 3 times in the book. And in the space of this wish to die, a sad reality of the insufficient value placed upon queer life, Jonah speaks it to the divine and begs the question, how much divine grace is there for queer life? How far will divine grace go in order to affirm queer life rather than use it to sustain normalcy and the normal social order? Limitations abound in Jonah. It's a small book with a brief glimpse of possibilities, and a book that calls us look again to see what are the potentials that we can get to build some kind of a future. Now, we can focus on what is fleeting in the book, but we can also build a sense of possibilities about the book if only we start to read beyond the pages of that book. And that's where I think we will find some greatness, because the book does set us up for these hard and difficult conversations, where theologies will change, where our perspective will change, where our orientation will change. Yeah, I guess I become now hopelessly utopic and romantic.